Welcome to Let's Play Rule the Waves 3 as Germany starting in 1935. This is episode 8 and we are in 1937 and we have just begun a war with the Soviet Union. Time to take a pause and think about what we're going to do. And the first thing that occurred to me is that do we be defensive or should we be offensive? Do we go and position the fleet in Northern Europe, where we can still impose a blockade against Russia, or do we forward deploy into the Baltic and engage in battles and stuff with the Russian fleet directly? This poll that I set a couple of weeks ago, been delayed by a birthday and what have you, is a pretty definitive answer to that question. And to put you out of your misery, I do agree. However, I want to unpack some of the considerations around that. And particularly, I wanted to first of all think about what's the history behind this. So classically, the Kriegsmarine in World War II bottles up the Russian fleet in the Baltic, in Leningrad, and it doesn't get to do very much. However, that's not the only historical model going along here. So if we go back to World War I, we have a situation where there is a force that is high quality and there is a force that is low quality, and the high quality force is small quantity and the low quality force is large quantity. So this was exactly the situation in the Black Sea. The Battle of Cape Sarich was a classic example of that, but throughout you had engagements between Yavuz Sultan Selim, or Gorban as it was previously known, and usually we still call it that in the First World War because it's German crewed and German admiraled, but technically it had been ceded to the Ottoman Empire in compensation for the couple of dreadnoughts that the Royal Navy nicked at the start of the war, which infuriated opinion in Ottoman Empire. Against this, until mid-late 1915, the Russians had to rely on 5 old pre-dreadnoughts. These weren't even kind of the last classes of pre-dreadnoughts. So the firepower between them is pretty uneven. 10, 11-inch guns, fine, whereas the Russians could muster 8 12-inch and 2 10-inch guns. Mainly 2 guns, heavy guns on each pre-dreadnought. The Germans could also have 12 5.9-inch, whereas the Russians had 8 8-inch and 52 6-inch. That's a whole world of pre-dreadnoughts, multiple caliber guns going there. And the Russians had thought about this and decided that one way to level up the deficiency, because the German ship had better fire control, more modern guns, the whole bit, qualitatively much superior, and of course crucially in speed. So they arranged for their battleships to fire in unison as one fire control unit. I have no idea how they managed that in an era of flags and semaphore and what have you, but it seems to have worked, because in this battle Gorban rocks up and they start trading blows on parallel courses for about 10 minutes before Admiral Schuon decides this isn't going to go well and retreats the force away from the Russians, and it's a Russian victory. And indeed the Russians, despite Gorban being individually a much better ship than all of the other Russian ships, the Russians dominate the Black Sea, attack the crucial coastal trade across the North Turkish coast, going from Constantinople to the front line to supply the troops, and going from various mining districts along the North Turkish coast and supplying that back to Constantinople, as well as mining the Bosphorus and generally making a nuisance of themselves throughout the war. So just because you have a qualitative advantage doesn't mean that going gung-ho is the most natural option. However, Rule the Waves 3 does favour quality over quantity. So I thought I'd like to think about this, and I'd like to amass as much information as I could before I made my decision, despite your encouragement to go aggressive. And I found by digging around that actually there's a lot of intelligence to be had scattered around the game. So obviously there's the map, and the map shows you, by clicking on each individual flag, shows you details of each of those possessions, colonies, districts, etc., which for your side have a massive detail about what's there, and it has a fair bit of detail for the enemy too. Then there is, by clicking in the map area not on the flags, you get a general situation of what's occurring in that area, the relative force balance between the different navies there, what's your ASW forces like, what are your submarine forces like, what's your trade protection forces like. And in the map details, there's also a tab for your ships, and that will show you the blockade value of all of your ships, as well as the base load. Now, the base doesn't matter in Northern Europe and Baltic because our base capacity is enormous, but if you were in another part of the world where you didn't have any bases, this would matter too. So quite a lot of information on that. And then you can go to the Area View tab to see details about the actual sea zone. There's some repetition here, but crucially, it tells you about your mine laying and mine sweeping effort, and your number of trade protection ships, and the required number of trade protection ships, and the ship ASW value. You then have the Base Overview tab, and that will go through each of the actual bases, talk to you about the various air bases, airships, and the number of batteries that you have in all of that. You then have your coastal fortification, which takes the base view to the next level in terms of exactly what each of the batteries have, the air bases have, as well as things like motor torpedo boat squadrons. And then you can go to your intelligence underneath your tension graph and filter just on the Soviet Union, and it will give you all of the intelligence we've gathered about the Soviet Union for a goodly while, since 1935. And then finally, you can visit the almanac, and the almanac has three elements. It has, on one side, general description of the country, its education or lack thereof, dock size, and so on. It has the naval guns that it's researched, and it has some element of what research breakthroughs it's made. Now, some of these are unknown, but I've been putting a bit of a intelligence effort into the Soviet Union, so I do know about half of them. You're also given a summary of the Navy and a summary of the Air Force and the size of the Air Force air bases, as well as speed and firepower characteristics for each of their model of plane in service. So quite a lot of stuff. If we take all of that and have a look at the main sea areas and other characteristics, we first of all have the Baltic, so Western Russia, it's a home, couple of airports, couple of airfields, couple of batteries, you can't invade it. The main thing is the Russians are stuck here right at the end. It's not a good place because, of course, Finland is neutral, and long may it remain so, and if it ever comes up after the war for seizure, by God, try and seize it. We have the Baltic states at a value of 9, which means it can be invaded. 3 ports, Raval, Riga and Lebau. 3 airfields at each of those ports. 6 batteries between 6 and 4-inch guns. And a defence value of 8. Now, it's not very transparent about how that defence value is created. I've looked at all the ones I can see, and I've come up with these rules of thumb. So 2 defence equals 3 batteries, 3 defence equals 5 to 6. I don't know where 4 sits, whether that's still 2 or whether it becomes 3. Likewise, you get 2 for 40 to 60 planes, you get 3 for 96 to 140 planes. You get 1 for a base load of 46 fleet, 2 for 54 and 3 for 100. And again, I don't know where the cutoffs are for that. You don't seem to get anything for airships or anything for motor torpedo boats. So that's a very rough guide to how much these various elements contribute to making a colony or a possession invadable. East Prussia, value 12, so can't be invaded. Couple of ports and airfields, 3 batteries, they're only 4-inch guns, 7 defense, no invasion. And East Germany, which is home, so also no invasion. Couple of ports, couple of airfields, again 3 batteries, this time 8-inch to 4-inch, 7 defense. For the overall area, we can find out that in trade protection, we currently have 7 ships. We need 17, so that needs addressing. We have a blockade strength of 65. The USSR has a blockade strength of 80. However, the USSR cannot blockade us because the Baltic isn't a home area. Northern Europe is a home area, and they can't reach Northern Europe because after active mine warfare has been researched, and that's a very early research, nobody can go through the Danish straits. So no one can travel from the Baltic to the North Sea or vice versa, except for the Germans. Your blockade has to have a minimum strength of at least 72. And it needs to be at least 110% of the enemy's fleet strength. So the enemy in this case is 80, so we'd need 88. However, for the Russians, there's a special blockade modifier. And you would take this 88 and multiply it by 0.7, which gives us 62. Now, I'm not clear whether I can blockade the Russians at 62 because I've got 65, or whether I need this minimum of 72. So we'll see when the war starts. Our ASW value is 49 and for ships and 27 for air. This needs to be increased. And our mine warfare is 96 minesweeping value, 400 mine laying value. Now, I have no idea what the Russian mine laying value is, but assuming that it's equivalent, I need to massively increase my minesweeping force, or I will run the risk of having my major fleet units mined and me bursting into tears. You don't want to see that. So there's going to be a lot of trawler conversions pretty soon. In Northern Europe, the Russians have a value of 12, so again, no invasion. 2 ports, Murmansk here, and off the map, Archangel. 1 airfield, which curiously seems to be at Archangel. No batteries, no defense, but no invasion. No one's going to go up there, really. Germany proper, again, no invasion. 3 ports, 3 airfields, 5 batteries, 6 and 4-inch. And a defense of 8. This is probably going to be a backwater. They only have a tiny amount of forces up there, so not too much to worry about once they've been dealt with. So trade protection, 24 ships. I only need 6. The blockade strength, 0, 3 for the Russians. Same kind of calculation. So my ASW force is 70, and again, 27 air. 64 minesweepers, who mainly need to go to the Baltic, and 261 mine layers. I'm going to suspect mine laying is going to be quite important. If we have a look at the fleet, they have 2 Amiral Lazarev class dreadnoughts, 25 knots, so, you know, pretty speedy. 10 13-inch guns, 13-inch belt, reasonably well done mid-1920s kind of battleship. 3 Grajdenin, 23 knots, again 13-inch gun, only a 9-inch belt, bit fragile, and 1 Marat, again 13-inch guns and a 12-inch belt. So 6 dreadnoughts, sort of similar, 22 to 25 knots, and then only a couple of heavy cruisers. The Kirov here, 9 10-inch, but only a 5-inch belt at 28 knots, and Voroshilov at 12 8-inch and a 7-inch belt and 31 knots. So Voroshilov seems to be a better balanced heavy cruiser. The Kirov seems to be a bit gun heavy. What I noticed looking actually at the silhouettes is that the Russians are very broadside heavy. In broadside, the Soviet fleet has 68 13-inch guns. 68. I mean, yes, they may only be 13 inches, but 68, crikey. However, in fore or aft, they only have 21, assuming that they can bring all of their ships to fire when either chasing or being chased. So I'd much rather face 21 than I would 68 of their 13-inch guns. So that's an important tactical consideration I'm going to take forward. The deployment of their fleet is to the Baltic, the vast bulk. So all of these battleships and both of these heavy cruisers, plus only one light cruiser, 18 destroyers, which isn't actually that many, 9 corvettes, 14 submarines, and 60 aircraft. In Northern Europe, up in Murmansk, they have 2 cruisers. They're not reporting any submarines, so I guess there are none. And in Northeast Asia, Vladivostok, Petropavlovsk, they have a cruiser, a seaplane carrier, and a destroyer, and another 60 aircraft. Interestingly, they've got some big stuff building. So we're in 37. In this year, they're going to get another heavy cruiser and potentially 15 destroyers. And these destroyers are 2,000 tonners, so very modern. Plus another 3 submarines. What type? I don't know. In 38, next year, they're going to get 2 more of the same heavy cruisers and a light cruiser and a seaplane carrier and 3 more destroyers and another submarine, possibly a mine layer. And then in 39 and then in 40, they're going to get a carrier, and these carriers are comparable to my Graf Zeppelin. So quite a bit of building. So if we have a look at the fleet tonnage, we get this kind of graph, where over here we have the Soviet Union, and over here we have Germany. And the dotted line is the building point. So underneath the dotted line is currently in service. So if we have a look at carriers here, they have none. They're both building. Whereas if we have a look at the capital ships, which is here, they're all in service. They have none building. This shows up a sort of interesting change in the balance of power. So right now, the Soviets have a big lead in their capital ships, in their battleships. We only have up to here with the Graf Spee. We are both building carriers, but I'm being outbuilt. In cruisers, Germany has the lead, and with further building, we'll still have the lead in cruisers. And then finally, in destroyers, at the moment, we have the lead compared to them, but they're building a lot, and so they will overtake us in the future. So the future is going to look like that, where their capital ships are worse. Yeah, the tonnage is a bit more than my tonnage, but my 3 ships will be so much better. They'll have the advantage in carriers, unless I start another one pretty quickly. They will remain inferior in cruisers, and they will overtake us in destroyers. So it's not a super clear Soviet advantage, but at the moment it is an advantage, and that will change in different areas as construction completes. When we have a look at the aeroplanes, we can see from the various types of Russian aeroplanes that their stuff is completely on the money for 1937. So a 200 knot per hour fighter with 2 firepower is completely straightforward. If we have a look at my planes in comparison, I've just highlighted in green the 2 that are a bit superior. So my naval patrol is faster with more firepower, and my torpedo bomber is faster with more firepower. Just for comparison, or for my awareness, this is our range. I've used light for the fighter, the patrol, and the scout because they need the range, and I've used heavy range for the bombers. Sadly, they don't give us an estimate of range for the Soviet fighters, but they do tell us the size of their air bases, which are medium and small in the Baltic, and just small in Northern Europe. So roughly equivalent, but my numbers are much better. We can also do a comparison around research. So here is a summary of my guns that are being researched, obviously 6-inch, 5-inch, etc. as well as the various technologies that are being researched. And what matters is that we're very advanced and the Russians are behind. They may well have been backward, but they have been stealing quite a lot of technology. However, their guns only go up to 13-inch compared to our 15-inch, domestically produced. Obviously, the Graf Spee has 16-inch. And then they have a number of researchers that we're aware of, some that we're not. So armour development is unknown, for example. If we cross-match the two, then these greens are areas where we have superiority over the Russians. They have superiority over us, never. And the greys, of which I think are about 7, are where we don't know what the Russian technology level is, but it's most unlikely to be superior to us. The greens are marked with 1 arrow because in all of these cases, we are 1 technology ahead of the Russians, with the sole exception of shipboard aircraft operation, where we seem to be 3 technologies ahead of the Russians. So yes, the Russians will have 2 carriers to our 1, but qualitatively our carrier might be considerably better. So that's something to bear in mind. And that brings us to that strategic question that I posed to you. So what do I think? Well, if I deploy to Eastern Europe, if I deploy to Northern Europe, the pros are that I can still blockade Russia. That's absolutely fine. And I don't get to risk any of my fleet. Certainly not until my next 2 battlecruisers get commissioned and I go up to a 3 battlecruiser strength. The cons are, during that period, whilst being on the defensive, the naval balance of power is not going to change. I am not going to weaken the Soviet Navy at all. That risks the war becoming a long war, and a long war risks increases in tension, and probably more importantly, it risks other countries going, you know what, we could have a war with Germany as well. Looking at you, Britain, and you're not terribly amused with us tensions at the moment. It also risks that the Baltic states, which is invadable, gets invaded. And we will lose prestige and victory points. Now, the victory points are trivial. They're like 50 a turn or something like that. But the prestige is serious because I only have a little bit of prestige. And every other turn, I'm likely to lose prestige if I am weak in the Baltic. If I have an offensive strategy and deploy to the Baltic, well, I can still blockade Russia. That's fine. I do have an opportunity to change the naval balance of power in my favour. I will protect the Baltic states and therefore protect my prestige. And there is a potential that victory can come an awful lot quicker. The disadvantages of an offensive strategy is I'm only 1 unlucky hit from losing or damaging my sole capital ship in the Graf Spee. So, you know, a bit nail biting. And I will probably, secondly, have to usually decline major battles. 1 battlecruiser against 5 dreadnought battleships. It would always be, let's say, exciting. But there again, I may play for exciting. And then lastly, I could have like a swing strategy. So I could deploy offensively and then say the Graf Spee gets damaged, and I could deploy defensively until the Graf Spee is fixed, and then go back onto the offense, and so on. And that might be a necessity. So let's sort out what we're going to do. The first thing I recommend you doing is going to your division editor and organize how the various divisions in your fleet are going to support each other and what role they're going to play. So this is super important. If you don't do this, you will just leave it up to the battle generator to pick whatever it likes, which, you know, can be painful. I mean, it still might do that, but setting these into roles will mean it's much more likely that you get the force structure that you'd like. Now, unfortunately, I think the battle generator the division editor here is a little bit confusing. So I'm going to represent this more visually for you so you can understand more what's going on. So imagine you have a core force, and that core force for me is going to be my large cruisers, my battle cruisers, and they will be the fleet flagship. And I will put my armored cruisers, my heavy cruisers, as a core. So they will follow behind the flagship. And that will be my central gun platform, certainly until the two new battle cruisers come online. And I will protect them ahead with a screen, and I will attach a destroyer division to the large cruiser squadron to protect it. And then I will create a scouting area ahead, and I will set the first light cruiser division to do that, and they are the best light cruisers, and they will scout for us, as well as the scouts that come from land-based air, and indeed from our own float planes. And then to support each of those, I've represented these with these blobs because support ships are often to the side, on the disengaged side of your force. They're for extra attack options when it comes to launching a torpedo strike and that kind of thing, or indeed torpedo defense. So I will attach the second light cruiser division as support to the fleet flagship. Their main role is chasing away destroyers that try and come up and torpedo me. I will add the third destroyer division to support the heavy cruisers with some destroyer attack options. And I'll put the second destroyer division as support to the scouts. This leaves a couple of divisions remaining, plus the carriers when they come. And they will be set to independence, so I'll decide what to do with them if they turn up in battle. So that's how I conceive of the structure of roles that you give through that division editor. And then there's the little matter of the to-do list. So I've divided the to-do list into 4. Strategic choices and construction choices. So strategic choices, well, my choice is to go offensive, bringing the Russians to battle under favourable conditions, which primarily means not too far north. I also obviously want to maintain a blockade, because blockading is going to be a major route to defeating the Soviet Union, even though I think the Soviet Union are probably quite resilient to blockade. They're easy to blockade, but they're probably quite hard to increase their unrest level because they're less dependent on maritime trade. I'm going to set the submarines to fleet support because there won't be any targets because blockade. I'm going to retain a force in Northern Europe in order to neutralize those 2 Murmansk light cruisers. They may be set to raiding, or they may be just a force that zooms around a bit, but I want them sunk. And once they have been sunk, I will deploy that force to the Baltic, and I will put the Northern European Air Force either into reserve, or once the Baltic have more airbase capacity, I'll swing them across into the Baltic. And I'll also make sure that I increase my spying and set it to high. It's set to medium, has been set to medium for a long while. It's still medium asterisk, meaning it's not fully effective. And I'm sure that when I set it to high, it may well never become fully effective. The Soviet Union is just a very hard place to spy into. But on the off chance that does happen, having high intelligence is very useful across a whole realm of things, not just in battle, but in minesweeping and in the trade war and all sorts of stuff. My construction choices, well, number 1, teeny tiny little trawler minesweepers. 3 months to build, a few months to work up. I need more minesweeping urgently. And indeed, one reason for keeping a swing and putting the fleet into Northern Europe is to wait for them to come, possibly. Number 2 is to build another division of my Z-56 2,000-ton destroyers, because I found that the Russians are building so many of them, and currently I only have 5. That will take 14 months plus workup, I will set submarine build to replace at least one, possibly more. Sadly, they can't be the quicker coastal submarines because they would be deployed to Northern Europe and then they couldn't move sea zones to the Baltic, sadly. I will potentially build a 12-inch battery in the Baltic states, which will take 10 months. I'm interested to see what impact the 12-inch battery will have on the defense of the Baltic states, what improvement that makes. So I think that's part experiment and part it may well be useful. And I'm probably going to have to halt construction on one of my runes if money is tight, which it's looking like being at the moment, although I have a bit of a war chest. Next, deployment choices. So obviously the fleet needs to deploy to the Baltic with a little bit of cover for the Murmansk light cruisers. I need to rebalance my ASW forces to the Baltic and my minesweeping forces to the Baltic, and deploy my air force to the Baltic once the air bases have expanded. And finally, and somewhat sadly, I have to be grown up and deactivate the airships. There was a message just before war began to say they're obsolete now. So yeah, that's probably a hint. Tactical choices is to avoid battles in the Gulf of Finland, specifically because they're too near to the Russian air bases and to the Russian ports, and the seaway is very narrow, and I'm sure it'd be very prone to mining. If you're not sure where the Gulf of Finland is, it's this little finger stretching from Hango off to Kronstadt. This one up here is the Gulf of Bothnia. Very rarely any battles in there. This is the Gulf of Riga, where there may well be invasion sorts of stuff going on. This is the Gulf of, well, Danzig in this period, Gdansk today, and this is the main Baltic. So if a battle appears here, probably no. If the battle appears at the neck of the Gulf of Finland, maybe. Depends. Say a cruiser battle, probably. A full fleet action, probably not. I will aim always to attack and defend convoys, partly because they're really interesting, but because Soviet convoys are probably going to be invasion convoys, and my convoys are probably going to be trade convoys, which, if I don't defend them, could increase unrest if they don't get through, and I want, obviously, to ward off their invasion attempts. I will always defend against enemy raids, coastal raids, or shipping raids. I will consider fleet battles carefully, and I will consider my coastal raids, or indeed raids on shipping, carefully. Really depends where it is. Obviously, there probably won't be many raids on shipping because blockade. And I will usually engage in cruiser actions, and I will consider the destroyer actions, although that's partly because destroyer actions are often really boring and, end up in stalemates. So those are all of my choices and my thinking around the strategy. Next up is going to be episode 9 and the war itself, the shooty bit. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode and unpacking all the choices and the information around going to war that's available. And I hope you enjoy me for the battles to come. Thanks for watching.